Investor Connect podcast program. This is Hall T. Martin. I'm the host of the show, in which we interview angel investors, venture capital, private equity, family offices, and many other investor groups for startups and growth companies. I hope you enjoy this episode. Thank you for joining us. Well, hello, this is Hall Martin with Investor Connect. Today we're here with Brett Commaille of Hlayisani Capital. Brett, thank you for joining us.
Really good to be here, and thanks for taking the time. Good to connect with similar-minded investors in a very exciting space.
So what was your background before investing in early-stage companies? What did you do before this?
It's a real mixed background. I think I'm trained sort of officially as a chartered accountant, and moved into the world of banking in various places, worked a little bit in the Middle East, and then headed back home to South Africa. And amidst starting a few things on the side, I came to the realization that I was far better at being entrepreneurial in the finance space and actually assisting those much smarter than me who had really good ideas and were trying to build good businesses. I was far better at supporting that than necessarily trying to start the next software giant myself. So we started a venture capital fund, and then started trying to get high net worth individuals to connect into the space, and built an angel investment group, and then turned that into the venture capital fund, which was the sort of formation of our much larger fund now. But probably about the last 12 years in and around venture specifically, but always been around early stage and young, exciting businesses before that. I have a bit of an obsession with trying to figure out how people build businesses and how they grow things.
Great. So what excites you right now?
It's a kind of a market that's full of all sorts of turmoil and difficulty, and that gets a lot of people negative, which for me means that there's a lot of opportunity if you're prepared to take the time. So we're in a market that's out of most people's minds at the bottom end of Africa, sitting in South Africa, and it's got a very young venture capital and venture market, an entrepreneurial market, which means it is pretty much green fields for opportunity. So every now and then somebody who comes from the more developed markets sees it and actually jumps in with both feet. So the opportunity to develop these young businesses and help them connect in a market where there's not really much competition for investors, certainly for me, is an exciting one.
Great. Well, what's your advice for people investing in startups in Southern Africa? What do you caution them before they write that first check?
So I think that one of the big things we learned, and particularly when we used to work with angel investors, and we managed to save a few people from a couple of mistakes. And that's the first thing is don't go it alone. I would always try to work with experienced, whether it's other investors or investment groups. It also allows you to spread your risk, and developing the discipline on not falling in love with the company, but learning when to actually cut and know when you shouldn't be throwing good money or bad money off to good, or good money off to bad. But I also think it's a sector where it's really important to not let a win or a loss go to your head. This is a business where you need to keep staying in, and you build your wins every now and then. And you need to take the time and actually just put in effort. So it's really exciting, but it's certainly not the glossy instant wealth that you often hear about when you hear the kind of typical, everyone hears the Facebook story in the last few years as opposed to hearing the tough things early on. And so it's a sector that takes, I think, a lot more risk or requires you to manage a lot more risk than most people expect. Now, I think one of the key things for us is also learning to take the time to do a proper due diligence. I know there are people who talk about how we do our deals on handshakes. Well, we believe that there's a lot more that goes beyond that. And the more time you put into and effort you put into that due diligence, the more risk you eliminate. And the more risk you manage to eliminate, the more value you manage to create in the business.
So what's your advice for people running startups in Southern Africa? What's your coaching there?
I have a bit of a motto that I grabbed from somebody else, and that's a statement of strong beliefs loosely held. So you do your work, you do the research, and you come to a point where you think this is how we're going to do something. And you need to obviously be very motivated and hold on to that approach. But you've got to be flexible enough to know when it's not the right approach and be able to pivot relatively quickly and relatively easily. I think it's true for many things in life, being able to understand when you're going down the wrong path. And I think that's fundamental in the startup space, because you may have a lot of things going for you. You might have the perfect idea, but it might just be the wrong time. It might just be the wrong market. There's a lot of things that could just be messing with your investment thesis. So the ability to adjust is critical. And I think I would say never underestimate the power of luck and good timing. So you've got to stay in the market and you've got to make things work. But a lot of the success stories are just people who were working hard but happened to connect to the right person at the right time, a chance meeting. And so I think you also can't beat yourself up if you're not getting everything to work perfectly all the time. It is a tough and a lonely journey, and you want to get around people who understand that and who will stick in it with you for the long haul, because it's always going to take longer than you think, and as you know, it's always going to cost more than you would have expected.
Well, let's talk about the state of investing in Southern Africa. How is the industry evolving, and what are the changes you see coming up with it?
So in terms of particularly the venture side of investing, we're probably easily 20, if not more years behind where some of the developed markets are in terms of having a properly functioning ecosystem. So many of the American and the even Israeli and the European markets, they had this kickstart from governments who put in money to create funds that then kind of drove the market. Whereas in certainly most of the African countries, venture capital was pretty much created by entrepreneurs trying to fund other entrepreneurs. And so it's only now that it's really starting to pick up and that the numbers are getting more and more interesting. We're still just a fraction of a fraction in terms of the international numbers, but those numbers are bigger than ever. And the South African market, for example, used to be on the African continent, used to take certainly the most transaction numbers and the largest amount. And now that's actually shifting. So we've actually got Nigeria, Egypt, and even Ethiopia taking on a significant amount. Kenya's taking on a lot of venture capital as well. So it's certainly gaining traction. I think the part that we struggle with is just getting each of those stages to work so that the one hands off to the other, because you often, if there's money available, it's a very specific stage of funding, and you're not always able to, in one market, actually do that handoff from one market to the next.
So let's talk about your fund. What's your investment thesis for the work you are doing? What startups fit that thesis, for example?
So if we look at, there's a statement about how many of the world's fastest growing economies are actually within Africa. And if I gave you the exact number now, I'd get it wrong, but it's certainly more than 50% of the top 20 are in Africa in terms of fastest growth, which means that it's something that's difficult for those governments to actually manage. You've also got a massive youth population. More than 50% of the population is under 30. So it's really the continent where you're going to see, if you compare it to Europe, where your population is aging, same thing in Asia. In Asia, you've got this massive young population coming in Africa, and it's putting strain as well on the government, which means there's a whole lot of opportunities, not necessarily where government is failing, but where government just can't keep up. And so those are some of the things that we look for. So that would be opportunities across agriculture, agricultural technology, same within medical space, medical technology, medical services, education. I mean, it's obviously fundamental with such a young population. Education, as we know, is key, but it's outstripping the ability of governments to provide it. So finding smart ways to educate, to do education at scale, and to connect people to the world of information that is available. And then you've kind of got these broad strokes of both ICT and manufacturing that fit around that. So that's the stuff that we look for and how it ties into our investment thesis. But I guess if you're someone else looking at Africa, the two big things that you would also be looking at would be fintech and energy. The only thing is, those are probably the two biggest sectors in terms of getting investment. So we're not necessarily chasing that because there's enough people there. But I mean, fintech across Africa and access to finance, especially because of what's happening with mobile data, and Africa is now kind of so connected through mobile data that people are redesigning credit models, and they're finding ways to offer finance based on your cell phone or your mobile data consumption, and they're finding ways to rejig things. So fintech is incredibly exciting, and you've got the banks and you've got large organizations and the DFIs are stepping in to operate in that finance, and obviously clean energy because of solar ability and some of the energy challenges in Africa is a huge opportunity. And I think if you say which startups fit that thesis, there are so many. So we're invested in our current fund. We've got, think about 7 assets. We're in the middle of a due diligence or 2, sometimes getting the total wrong. But we certainly have investments that are stepping into both the education space. We're looking at medical services. We're playing in the ICT space. And I think the only thing is, you don't necessarily want to be too focused unless you are specifically fintech because of the size of that opportunity and clean energy and infrastructure. There you've got focused funds. Everywhere else, there's just an opportunity to be broad, and because there are so many opportunities available.
So, what are the challenges in the space for the South African startup? Aside from funding, we've talked about that, but are there regulatory issues? Are there technical or market issues? What's holding back the community?
I think one of the biggest things is Africa is completely not a homogeneous market. Every country, every territory is very different, very diverse. If you make it in one country, it does not mean that you can make it in another. And there are some examples of some runaway successes, particularly fintech products like M-Pesa, which is this massive mobile wallet product, did extremely well in one country and moves across to the other country, and it was a complete failure. So understanding each market is important and certainly makes it challenging. It's not easy to just jump from one market to the next. And so, but it does mean that if you look at your local market, most of the time the local market is relatively small. You may have a large population, but to find that sort of middle class, for example, as a target population, it's very seldom that you have that in just your market. So you need to found your company already looking into other territories, looking where you can grow. So you've got to be sort of born. The company needs to be born with internationalization mindset, and so finding networks to assist in that global growth, funders who are prepared to support that, and getting enough traction in your local market to show that you deserve that support to move into the other territories. It's very different to founding a company in a US city where you've got 10 million people that could make your company relatively large without you even having to leave the city borders.
Well, great. Well, you talked about fintech and energy being the 2 big applications there that are immediate opportunities for investors. And you described the fintech pretty well. Tell us more about the energy sector. What applications within energy or clean tech maybe is the one that is getting the most traction there?
I think I'll start with the challenge. The challenge on the energy sector is generally that it requires a significant upfront investment. So it's usually the infrastructure funds that go there, which is why funds such as ourselves leave that to them. But at the moment, particularly even in South Africa, we've had some real energy issues with our energy provider. It's a single large provider, not quite keeping their maintenance up. And so it's brought out those challenges, which means you've now got a lot of large businesses going for solar installations and that. So as solar technology has gotten a lot cheaper, it's now becoming something that is being applied on an industrial scale. So there's a lot of combined finance and solar products that are going into large business to actually sell, to provide security of energy supply, and also to try and take some of the strain off the infrastructure. And you're seeing that in multiple territories. There's also a lot of work that's at really large scale going into the hydro and even into the wind space. But I must say, in terms of most accessible, solar seems to be the one that's getting the most attention, particularly because of the abundant supply of solar energy.
Oh, great. Well, in the last few minutes that we have here today, what else should we cover that we haven't?
For me, there's always been a bit of hesitancy to get near the African continent because it is so misunderstood. I think it's a space that is incredibly exciting, and there's some very sophisticated markets. You've got, for example, South Africa has a globally awarded financial system. So there's a lot more sophistication than you would expect. And I think it's one worth taking a look and coming to find the right sort of investment partners. In a world that's been battling with everything from negative yield curves to poor to negative returns, I think it's worth looking outside of the bubble to see whether or not there are good partners to approach. And if you do, there are multiple markets where you as an investor can come and connect with local regulators. You can come into the local, so there's both venture capital and there's angel associations. And there are a lot of opportunities for people who have good market connections within the US markets and the European markets to actually connect to those African startups and African businesses and help them grow into the US and the European markets, because they do have a lot to offer and they've got a different way of doing things, sometimes which can be surprisingly applicable in each of those markets. I mean, we've got one company which looked at the US markets, and we were quite surprised to see that actually it's a world-leading product and one that has massive applicability, and you would just never have thought it. So it's worth taking a look, and I think that if you can find a way and the right partners to do it, certainly make the trip or at least make the call.
Well, that's great. Appreciate you telling us more about the market today. Hope to have you back for a follow-up soon. How best for listeners to get back in touch with you?
So I'm on Twitter. None of these are going to be easy. I'm Twitter at Brett Commaille, and email at Brett@Hlayisani. And as you said, that's going to have to be in the show notes for somebody to get that down. And we're relatively easy to get hold of. So we look forward to hearing from people who are interested to connect.
Oh, great. We'll add those to the show notes. Want to thank you for joining us today and appreciate your taking time to share these thoughts with us.
Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Investor Connect helps investors interested in startup funding. In this podcast series, experienced investors share their experience and advice. You can learn more at investorconnect.org. Paul T. Martin is the director of Investor Connect, which is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to the education of investors for early-stage funding. All opinions expressed by Hall and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of Investor Connect. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.